separated chapter 12 from chapter 13. Covet earnestly the best gift. After he spends the whole chapter talking about gifts. He says, but covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet show I unto you a more excellent way. So he's going to show them a better way, which then on the face of it, you would say, well, if it's going to be a better way, that's what I ought to do, instead of relying on this old way, right, which isn't as good. Okay? And so many people forget that as they go into chapter 13. Because, you know, as you just said, love drives everything. And as I pointed out there at the last part of Mark, where it shows very plainly what the purpose of the gifts was, which was to confirm the word, we have an example of that very thing happening in the last chapter of Acts. And that's when Paul was shipwrecked on the island of, King James calls it Melita, its modern name is Malta. But when he was shipwrecked on that island, and he went to gather wood to put on a fire, a snake bit him. And evidently it was a very poisonous snake, because the islanders sat down and watched, kind of like past the popcorn, we got a show coming on, he's going to swell up and die, okay? And the conclusion they made at that point was, this man must be terrible, because God tried to drown him and wasn't successful. Now he sent a snake to bite him. Well, when he didn't swell up and die, they decided he was a god. All right? Now, rather than being a god, he was from God, and that's why he didn't swell up and die. And then they were willing to listen to his message. And so that's an example of what Mark was talking about at the end of his message, his letter, the gospel there, when he said that these signs will convince people that you're from God and your message is worth listening to. The word would be confirmed by these signs. One of those signs was taking up serpents. Well, Paul took up a serpent. It bit him. He didn't die as they expected, which in their mind convinced them he was from, at least from God or a God, and his message was worth listening to. And so you have to, really to get the full picture of all this, you have to put all of that together.
Yeah.
Okay, and see that the gifts were for a particular purpose. When that purpose was accomplished, they were no longer needed, and it was declared in other passages that they would come to an end.
Yeah. I like how you put the message was worth listening to. That's what these things were for. To show people that what they have to say is worth listening to. And if you can see somebody be bitten by a snake like that and survive, they must have something good to say. And that was the whole point of these things. However, those things are not needed anymore because the greatest of these is love. So what's the song and the passage says, they'll know we are Christians by our love, not by our miracles that we work, but by our love. That's the new way to show that we are Christians, the better way to show that we are Christians.
The word excellent in chapter 12, verse 31, that has the idea of preeminent. Love is preeminent above all else.
Right, love is preeminent. It's the greatest of all. And that's what should drive all these things. First place, right. All right, anything else on chapter 13? All right, let's move on to 14. It's really continuation. And it's all continuing, I guess, but like Rick was saying, chapters and verses were put in. But it says in verse 1, pursue love and desire spiritual gifts. He says pursue love and desire spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. So Paul, he says that they need to realize, or they needed to realize, this wonderful gift, this wonderful grace of love. Follow after it always, and all the gifts and those things will work hand in hand. They're compatible with love. Gifts actually can help them attain love. And the hope is to spread the word. To prophesy here is the word that's used, but to spread the word of God through love, in love. Now, at this time, they still had the spiritual gifts, but they had to use and work those spiritual gifts in love in order for them to be proper. Verse 2 says, "For he who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God, for no one understands him. However, in the Spirit he speaks mysteries." So when somebody just speaks in a tongue that couldn't be understood to the hearers, to the congregation, he didn't really speak to them. They could hear him blah, 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 and he knew what he was saying, and God knew what he was saying. That's why it says he didn't speak to men, but he spoke to God as far as the understanding. And since they didn't understand him, the only one that could was God. And then he talks about these things that are important for these people to hear, but they remain mysteries because they have no idea what he's saying. So that's a roundabout way of saying, don't speak in tongues unless you can interpret or unless there is an interpreter there. But when you are speaking in tongues, be preaching the word of God. Be furthering the kingdom. Be prophesying. And we talked about before that it was rare that the one doing the speaking in a different language had the ability to interpret. Most of the time, the interpreter was a gift of somebody else and not the gift of the one who could speak in tongues. So Paul is saying, use these things for the right purpose. Verse 3, "But he who prophesies speaks edification and exhortation and comfort to men. But he who speaks in a tongue edifies himself. But he who prophesies edifies the church. I wish you all spoke with tongues, but even more that you prophesied. For he who prophesies is greater than he who speaks with tongues, unless indeed he interprets, that the church may receive edification." So Paul says here, the preaching is the important thing. Speaking in tongues, being able to speak in a different language is a good thing when it's used properly. The one who prophesies in tongues edifies the church. The one who's just speaking in tongues without preaching the word or preaching the word or preaching in love or have an interpreter there that they can interpret for him only is glorifying himself.
Going back to chapter 11, I think Paul is speaking here in the context of the assembly, speaking in an unknown tongue when everyone in the assembly are of a common language. They have the same language.
Right.
You're speaking a language that's not their native language. You're basically just speaking into the air.
Yeah, you're showing what you can do and not.
And in the context of the assembly, it has the sense of trying to outshine one another.
Right. This is definitely talking about the assembly, the congregation coming as being together.
And that's generally when people start blurting out in tongues, is when they're
Right.
assembled together.
Yeah, and we'll see later that they were doing everything all at the same time, and that was causing confusion. but he says, don't speak in tongues if it's not needed. When you're speaking in tongues, make sure there's an interpreter or whatever the case would be to teach or preach to the people who need to hear that tongue. But if you're just doing it to show you can do it, you're only concerned about yourself. And that goes with anything, being conceited and arrogant. If you have a gift and you exploit it to make yourself look good and you don't use it for what it's worth, then it's arrogant. And that's not the reason that God gave you these gifts. But the one who preaches the word is greater than those who speak tongues. Because you can speak tongues, but if you're not preaching with it, if you're not doing it for the reason that it was there for, then it's kind of useless. So he's telling them, make sure that you're doing things right. And he goes on to verse 6, "But now, brethren, if I come to you speaking with tongues, what shall it profit you unless I speak to you either by revelation, by knowledge, by prophesying, or by teaching? And again, back to the Gospel Advocate commentary that I read. It says, Paul now transfers the matter to himself, that if even he, though he was an apostle, came speaking with a tongue, they would receive no profit unless he interpreted the words of the tongue as conveying some revelation received from God. So, again, why do it if it's not necessary? But when you do it because you need to spread the word of God. Any comments or questions so far? All right. Verse 7. Even things without life, whether flute or harp, when they make a sound, unless they make a distinction in the sounds, how will it be known what is piped or played? So if all the instruments in the band are not playing the part that they should be playing, what's it sound like? Off tune. I believe in... Sounds like modern music, you're right. But nobody's going to know what song is being played. If the marching band at halftime would get out there and one of them was playing this song and one of them was playing this song, or one of them part and one of them playing, we don't know what they're playing. It takes me forever to figure out what they're playing anyway. I'm trying to say, what is that song? But if they're not playing the right part, we're not going to know. So if someone is speaking in tongues, it's just a bunch of who knows what they're talking about, is what he's saying here. I remember an episode of Barney, or Andy Griffith. I think Barney was trying to play an instrument, or somebody was trying to play an instrument, they were all off, and that's what it sounds like. Kevin probably knows what I'm talking about. And then he goes to verse 8, and he gets a little bit more pointed with it. He says, for if the trumpet makes an uncertain sound, who will prepare himself for battle? So in these times, they use the trumpet to make folks aware of certain things. If somebody important was coming, the trumpets would sound, the king or whatever. If sound the battle cry, it was a battle cry. So he's saying here, if somebody doesn't play the trumpet the way they're supposed to, they're not going to know what that trumpet sound is for. So they're not going to be able to get ready for battle if it's not played properly. It's just a bunch of noise, again, is what he's saying. So he's telling them, don't do it just to be heard. Do it for a good reason. And do it properly. And then verse 9, so likewise you, unless you utter by the tongue words easy to understand, how will it be known what is spoken? For you will be speaking into the air. So they must make sense, or it's pointless to talk. There's no use just to show your gift if you don't need it, if it's not needed. Verse 10, there are, it may be, so many kinds of languages in the world, and none of them is without significance. So he's saying, yes, there are different languages in the world, and they're all there for a reason. But just because you can speak that language doesn't mean you need to. If I got up here and started speaking in Chinese, just because I could, you all would have no idea what I was talking about. If I got up here and started speaking in Koine Greek even, about 4 of you would know what I was talking about every 5 minutes or so. But that would be pointless. I can't do that. I once met a preacher who was actually from Thessalonica, so he was pretty good with his Greek. I would like to be you because you all don't speak that language. It's just toot my own horn or toot my own trumpet.
You know, again, we get back to the purpose of gifts. You know, what would these gifts of tongues do for the early church? Well, they'd allow people to preach in areas where they didn't know the language. And so we can see a purpose for it. Now, would it be nice to say, okay, I'm going to Russia as a missionary, and God, please give me a command of the Russian language miraculously so I can go preach to them? Well, yeah, that'd be great. But, you know, if we're going to send somebody to Russia to preach, it ought to be somebody who studied Russian and can speak it, you know,
right,
as opposed to standing up there waiting for the Lord to put Russian in his head. And the point made in verse 10 is these tongues are languages. not just sounds, they're languages. And there's a purpose for giving these early Christians the gift of speaking in, and the whole idea of speaking in tongues is speaking in a language that you've never studied. And I can speak a little Spanish. Can't understand it because people who speak Spanish speak too quick.
You hear too slow.
Or I hear too slow. But I can say a few words. I like to teach people when they call me and I know who it is, and I'll say, "Buenos dias, ¿cómo está?" You know, and they say, "Do what?" I say, "For English, press 1." But I don't, you know, and somebody said, "Can you speak Spanish?" And I say, "Un poco," which means a little. Okay? And I said that to one person who could speak Spanish, and he corrected me, and he said, really little. I mean, you know, it wasn't just un poco, it was un poco mucho or something. You can barely speak Spanish. But I studied Spanish a little when I was in school. And I still remember a few of the words. But that's what those tongues were. They were languages. And the purpose was so these 13 men could go out into the whole world and fulfill the commission and preach to people that had different languages.
Right.
That's the whole purpose of it.
The tongues were essential early on. At this point in time, they're becoming less essential. And more than anything, I think what Paul's addressing, really chapters 11 through 14, is the motivation and the desire, the function to want to speak in tongues in the assembly when it's not necessary,
Right. When it's not necessary.
when it's connected to love. Why are you motivated to do that other than wanting to be puffed up, vaunt yourself? Rather, if you love one another, work to the building up, to the profiting of all, to the edification of the body. That can't be achieved by trying to outdo one another with spiritual gifts.
Right.
You have to love and care for one another.
Yep. The spiritual gifts weren't for showing how good you are, but was for showing how good God is. And the Gospel Advocate, after verse 10, says, all languages are significant. So the languages used by those who spoke with tongues were significant. The difficulty was not in the language used, but the ignorance of the hearers. The argument is that all of the languages that are in the world are for utility, and none are used for the sake of mere display. So it should be with those who had the power of speaking them in the church. They should speak them only when they would be understood. So that's basically what we were all saying here. That was the point of them. All right.
What actual language?
Their actual language.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know the variety of languages.
Yeah, a bunch of languages, but the point was to speak in their language so they could understand it. Okay, let's do verse 11. Therefore, if I do not know the meaning of the language, I shall be a foreigner to him who speaks, and he who speaks will be a foreigner to me. So neither will be profited by the other in speaking or hearing that language that is not understood. Not going to profit the hearer or the one doing the speaking, and it's not going to profit the kingdom, the church. The Greeks used the word barbarian, Gospel Advocate says, of any foreigner ignorant of the Greek language and Greek culture. So some of your translations may say barbarian instead of foreigner, but that's what they would use for the word foreigner. But it would be like, they'd be like a barb. Nobody would benefit from this if the language was not known by the hearer. Okay, let's go ahead and stop there. We will pick up with verse 12 next week. Is there any more comments or questions?